you're coming from tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is the first in a series of webinars, just educational webinars about anti-racism. This one is on understanding whiteness. The next one coming up next month is on beyond colorblindness. And hopefully you can see the website there, writelibrary.org/anti-racism 101. You can go there to register for next month's webinar as well and see the whole series. Wright Library's Let's Talk program is committed to bringing people together to talk about issues that matter. And as part of that series, we've been having conversations about race and racism for several years. And we've discovered that, these conversations can be really uncomfortable, but they're necessary. And as a result of providing opportunities for people from around the Miami Valley really to come together, we've been connecting people who would otherwise not be connected. I do want to acknowledge that in this polarized environment with a divisive election coming up, people are on all sides of this issue. Not everyone embraces the concept that understanding whiteness is the key to making life better for America's Black and Brown citizens. Wright Library is nonpartisan. One of our core values is intellectual freedom. And so we have curated a thoughtful collection of other perspectives on this issue at our website, writelibrary.org/anti-racism 101. You'll find that collection there, and I encourage you to go and look at those. This series, no matter what your politics, this series and this webinar about understanding whiteness is educational. It became really apparent that there was a need for this kind of education during our summer conversations on race and racism in America with all the protesting, and people are hearing these concepts and ideas in the news, understanding whiteness, white supremacy, white privilege, anti-racism. And a lot of people came to our conversations really wanting to have a better grasp of what these concepts really were, what they entailed, and just have a better understanding about them. And so we're so pleased to be partnering with Dr. Michaela Null. She's from SURJ, Ohio. She is doing the series for us. She completed her undergrad studies at Wright State and spent a year as an Americorps VISTA volunteer at TOP, that's the other place, which is now Homefull in Dayton. It's a daytime homeless shelter. Before getting her PhD in Sociology and Women's Studies at Purdue University in 2012. She's taught classes in Sociology and Women's Studies at University of Wisconsin-Fond du Lac, Sinclair, Wright State, and Wittenberg. And she is a member of SURJ-Ohio, and she currently works as a makerspace specialist. So please help me welcome Dr. Null. Thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Michaela. And it'll take us just a minute to transition.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I am going to start sharing my screen. That will take just a second. And actually, I want to make sure that I'm doing. There we go. All right. So hopefully everyone can see me. We are going to be talking about understanding whiteness, which is not necessarily a direction that people tend to go when they talk about race, but we're going to talk about why that is important and what function that would serve in anti-racism. So you might ask, what is whiteness? So people kind of, people tend to know a white person when they see them, maybe. So this concept of whiteness is relatively new. But before we talk about that, first we need to talk about what is race. And race is an idea, not a biological fact. So a lot of us, we still have these preconceived ideas that race is linked to our biology, or race is linked to our genetic makeup. And that is not the case. So if you look at scientific, biological, anthropological research, you'll see that it's pretty well accepted that there is no biological link to race. And I'll tell you what I mean by that, because I'm sure a lot of you are like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. We can see people's skin color, right? And isn't that a matter of what their genes are? And that's not untrue, but what is true is that just because someone has a particular skin color and we might categorize them in a particular way does not necessarily mean that there's some gene inside people, or even a series of genes that are linked together that make up race. One way that we can tell that race is a concept and not biological is that the definition has changed over time. So the definition of race is not static. It doesn't remain the same. Over time, it changes to be used in particular ways, often by people in power. There was a point at which we made legal definitions of what race was in the United States. There are differences in how race is defined across cultures. So we'll dive a little bit more into that. But what I want to say is that race is how we categorize people based on our perception of certain physical characteristics, which we associate with other characteristics. So what I mean by that is there are physical characteristics that are obvious that we can see, but that does not necessarily mean that the genetic makeup of two people with a similar skin tone is anything alike at all. It can be relatively entirely different. And I want to look really quickly at sort of how our definitions of race came about and changed over time. I'm gonna show a short video clip for that, and that will require me to switch over to this. So this is a series, a PBS series called The Origin of Everything. And this particular segment is the origin of race in the United States. We're not going to watch the whole thing. We'll watch a part of it where she talks specifically about sort of how race and racial definitions started to morph.
Asking, what were some of the earliest definitions of race? Well, before we started thinking of race along the lines of biology, genetics, or phenotype, aka physical appearance, did you know that it was largely considered a category of kinship or group affiliation? In the 16th century, we started to see the use of the word race in English, but it isn't attributed to physical traits or behavior. It meant quite literally that you were all members of the same household, group, or shared a common ancestor. But when did race shift to being less about kinship groups to sounding more complicated than the lyrics to I'm My Own Grandpa? Well, we can see that starting in the colonial era. And that brings us to our second question. Why did we see the shift in the idea of race in the 17th and 18th century? The answer to this question is firmly rooted in two things: the rise of global capitalism that was backed by slavery and colonialism, and a period of theorizations in Europe known as the Enlightenment. When the Spanish began the colonization of the Caribbean and later Latin America after 1492, they looked to native populations to mine silver and gold under brutal working conditions. They set about enslaving, attacking, and murdering those who didn't comply. Thousands of native people died as a result of overwork, genocide, or because they were exposed to new diseases brought over with the Spanish settlers. And when England established its first successful long-term colonies in North America in Virginia in 1607, they looked to mirror this pattern of enslavement with native people, while also seeking copious amounts of silver and gold. But they had limited success with this route because, one, Virginia wasn't exactly rich in gold, and two, native populations were able to resist the efforts of early settlers through fighting back or escaping and blending into adjacent native groups. English settlers still wanted to make money off of this venture, so they began to look to alternative ways of making Virginia profitable, and that came in the form of tobacco. But a major problem with growing tobacco is that it requires a ton of labor, and the laborers needed the agricultural skills to turn the crop into cash. Because they had already met with sustained resistance from native populations, English settlers looked to other potential labor sources, enslaved Africans and indentured British laborers. There are some important distinctions to make between these two groups. First, indenture was a contractual agreement with fixed terms that varied widely. Some indentured servants were brought to the colonies against their will, either as a punishment or because they were children. Terms of these contracts were often very exploitative, but many came willingly in exchange for their passage to the new colonies, and many of these indentured servants finished the terms of their contracts and began lives as property owners. Enslavement of Africans was an entirely different category of labor from indenture, because one, slavery was for life, not for a fixed term or a number of years. Two, slaves were not considered human. Three, it was not a contract because it takes two consenting humans to enter into a contract. And four, slave laws were enacted codifying hereditary slavery, meaning that if you were enslaved and had children, then those children would also remain in slavery. With the expansion of this system, there was understandably some resistance, even from Europeans. So in order to continue to justify slavery, we start to see the pseudoscience of race emerge that connected physical features, behavior, and legal rights right around the 18th century when colonial use of slaves was expanding. Anthropologist Audrey Smedley notes that scientific ideas about physical appearance and racial difference in the 18th century were largely folk ideas used to justify already existent social norms.
All right, so hopefully that makes clear a couple of things that I'm talking about when I talk about the fact that race is a constructed category and not biological. So some of you might actually be surprised that our ideas about race sort of fermented in the Enlightenment. And we actually used these ideas of science. It was really pseudoscience, but we used science to try to justify conditions that already existed. And we see that from early Enlightenment when we were creating typologies. So Darwin, for example, created typologies of animals. And we saw a rise in people trying to do racial categorization as well. Eventually, when we knew a little bit more about genetics, we started to use science in that way, but our knowledge at the time was limited, and our culture was heavily immersed in overt white supremacy. So let's go back to this definition. How we categorize people based on our perception of certain physical traits, which we associate with certain characteristics. So one reason that there is an issue with racial categorization at all is not just because there are categories. Put people into categories, that's fine, but specifically those categories were associated with certain kinds of traits. Traits about what kind of intelligence someone had, whether they were logical or whether they were animalistic. And since it was the Enlightenment and largely Europeans who were creating those definitions, you can probably guess who was considered to be the smart ones, the beautiful ones, the ones that were civilized. So it's not just that these racial categorizations were created to justify a system, but that they also reinforce these ideas of who, and you should be able to tell by looking at someone, who is good, bad, civilized, uncivilized, etc. And this was sort of a scientific obsession that we had for a while, that we wanted to be able to look at someone or something and know exactly everything about it. So at that same time period, you see phrenology. So if you've ever seen the images of different sections on the head, and people felt their bumps on the head to try and figure out what kind of personality traits someone had, that's the same time period that we are going beyond just the initial racial categorization and really trying to foment that into science. So racial categorization, it's not random and it's not supported by science. So there were scientists who did racial science, but for the most part, they were going by their already taken for granted ideas about race, taken for granted ideas about how biology worked. But these definitions were created, curated, and promoted by white supremacy that existed or exists in different areas of our society, including culture, science, interactions, politics, and systems. So here I'm using this term white supremacy, promoted by white supremacy. And what do I mean by that? And I don't mean necessarily some shadowy figure who's pulling the strings of white supremacy, but I mean ideas about how white people were better than everyone else. Genetically better, physically better, mentally better, morally better. And in fact, moral betterness was one of the things that was used to justify who was human, who was not human, who needed to be governed, because otherwise, you know, they just wouldn't behave well enough for the rest of us. And so racial categorization continues over time. And so we have this period, though, where racial categorization has started. So we have this idea of race that shifts to be more about, you know, your physical traits rather than your family group. But we also have this period where we do not have the concept of whiteness. And this is a really foreign concept to a lot of people, because if you have Blackness, then you have whiteness. But we really didn't have that yet. And if you can think back to your history books, your US history books, and think about the groups that were talked about in the early colonial periods of the United States. Think about the wars and the names associated with the wars in the early territories. So those were French, British, Spanish, right? Those are not races. Those are ethnicities. Those are national origins. And so we tended to think about people as separate groups of people. We definitely separated the Spanish from the French, right? But we did not see them as a unified group of people. So they were actually at odds with one another. And it wasn't until later that those groups of people were sort of brought together by this idea of what we call whiteness. So An example of this is the early colonization of the United States tended to be these more wealthy European countries. So that is sort of the first wave of people coming over and settling the United States. Then later on, we have other groups of Europeans start to come over, including Irish, Polish, lots of those sorts of ethnicities that we still have some lingering ideas about. Italians, right? About who they are and what they are and how they have these negative characteristics that are still often associated with them. And that's because there was a period where they weren't really considered white people because whiteness wasn't a concept. And it was more about ethnicity. And the British definitely saw themselves in opposition to the Irish. So white did not always exist as a category. It was actually created and perpetuated to continue the system of slavery. So what was happening is Irish and other poor immigrants came over and they were working either as indentured servants or just at very low wages, and they came in interaction with enslaved folks. And that got them sort of thinking about their common ground. And people who were wealthy thought this is a problem, because if they see their common ground, then we are the enemy, right? And they're going to try and tear this system down. There's a lot of fear around that. And this was something that happened more than once in the history of the United States. And so what happened is people started to highlight skin color over ethnic background, right? And in addition to that, these wealthy slave owners gave certain rights and privileges to people with lighter skin. Privileges and reign often over enslaved Blacks. And so that system was divisive. And in fact, let's go and look at sort of an example of what I mean by, for example, the Irish weren't always white. There's actually a book called How the Irish Became White. There's also, I think, an article about how Jews became considered white, which that could be a whole lecture on sort of the ethnic and racial classification of Jews. But for example, this is a political cartoon that I like to show to demonstrate what we mean by white people, like the Irish, weren't always considered to be white. So this is a political cartoon, and you can see on the one side, there is a British woman, and on the other side, there is an Irish woman. And at the bottom, it says the Irish Declaration of Independence that we're all familiar with. So if you know anything about the history of Britain and Ireland, you know that Britain ruled over Ireland, and they saw themselves as much better than the Irish. So we look at this woman on the left. She has delicate features. She's dainty in dress. She looks at least middle class. Her dressing is nice. She's not dirty. She has nice shoes on. She looks weak and delicate. And then we see the depiction of the Irish woman. She is very masculine, very large. She has a threatening stance. She has her apron or dress pulled up. She's clearly of a lower class. And she also has particular facial features, right? So one thing that people do to distinguish themselves from other groups of people is to emphasize certain physical features that we think make them look less human. And that's part of what was happening here. So she has this jawline that is much broader and wider, a large nose, a small forehead. She even has big earrings on. And those are not so different from the kinds of racializations that we see of Black folks in the United States. So here's an example. So if you look at these two pictures together, the racialization of both of those people looks very similar, right? Other than one is not in a threatening stance. So we see that these two categories of people were seen at one time as more alike than different. But it's through this process and this maintenance of wealth and slavery that the category of whiteness really comes out. And when whiteness starts to be a thing that's emphasized, skin color, is when we start to see race science really take and start to rise. So what are then the social meanings of whiteness? So whiteness has been used as sort of a standard for humans against which other people are measured. And so there's lots of situations in our society where we use one type of person and use them as the epitome of what a human should be or what a person should be, right? We do this with men versus women. We do this with poor versus rich, right? We associate certain traits with, you know, goodness, smartness, betterness, things to be aspired to, right? And so we use that standard, and then in our racial system, whiteness is the standard that we're set. And we see that perpetuates itself. Whiteness is also equated with purity, that is racial purity. So for example, when we start to think about race on a pseudogenetic level, we had ideas of blood quantum levels. How much white blood you have to be white. Now, like, blood is not a thing that you can fill up, if you didn't know. Like, I just can't fill my tank. What they're really referring to is your ancestry, right? We also had the 1 drop rule in the United States, which meant if you had 1 drop of Black blood, that made you Black. So part of this is constructing whiteness as pure, as rare, like not rare, but like desirable. It meant something, and that not everybody could be white. It was exclusive. That's the word I was looking for. We also associated it with sexual purity. For example, with white women, lots of depictions of white women in that era, the colonial era, areas of enslavement, were that white women were these innocent women that were often preyed upon by Black men, by Chinese men, by any man who wasn't white. We also have whiteness associated with goodness, which I mentioned a couple of times. But we have ideas of whiteness and goodness that we put together all the time, and we don't even think about it. We also have the eugenics movement. So some people have no idea that the eugenics movement is even a thing that existed in the United States. So the eugenics movement was a movement based on genetic purity. And this was late 1800s, so well before the Nazi era in Germany. In fact, lots of historical folks think that the Nazis borrowed from the United States eugenics movement for a lot of their ideas about racial purity. So the eugenics movement was a movement, and it was a popular movement. It wasn't a fringe movement. It was pretty mainstream in the United States. A movement that claimed that some people had good genes and some people had bad genes, right? We didn't really know that much about genes yet. Like, we were still on Mendelian genes, which is like just looking at phenotypical traits. We didn't really know about the inner workings of genes or genetic codes or anything like that. So we're looking at these phenotypes, these physical traits, and we're looking at the social conditions of people, right? And the logic at the time was that, you know, some people just, they die earlier than other people. You know, enslaved Africans, they die at younger than others, or the Irish. That, you know, so originally it wasn't necessarily about race, but it was about this idea that some people had good genes and other people had bad genes. So for example, at that time we also had ideas about people who had mental illness or disabilities as having bad genes. And what this meant for the eugenics movement is, if we want a strong nation, the eugenics movement thought you can't have these bad genes breeding in or with these good genes, because then they're mixed up and that makes us less of a strong nation. And eventually it shifted its focus more to skin color, more to black and white or white and non-white. And it was the eugenics movement that actually brought on laws that said things like, you can't marry outside of your race. Not that that wasn't a sentiment people had, but the eugenics movement was something that got those things put into law, right? Because of the racial fears that we had. I'm going to check my time really quick. Okay. And the eugenics movement was supported by a lot of this pseudo-race science. So there were lots and lots of articles about differences and physical differences in blacks and whites. This is where a lot of like racial mythology comes from, about sort of the differences between certain groups of people. So that was a lot. All right, so maybe we'll go back for a second and look at this. All right, so what we know is racial categories are created. And if anyone wants resources on sort of the biological ideas behind race, and the idea that race as a biological category isn't a real thing, but in fact an idea that we have in our heads. And one way that we can think of that is, for example, we can think of Oprah, right? We think of Oprah and we automatically think she's Black. We think of President Obama and we think he's Black. And he is, but he has ancestry that is both white and Black. But we think of him as Black, right? Like if we're casually thinking. And so because our racial categorization is based on the phenotypes that we can see in people and how we decide to categorize them, then it's the social and not about what's in your genes. And we can think about different ways that we could categorize people. We could categorize people based on their ear shape or how long their big toe is. But we don't do that, right? We don't assign meaning to that. So what's happened is we have created racial categories and we've assigned meaning to them. So then we have the history of whiteness coming through, emphasizing this idea of skin color and skin color making a difference. And then why is that important? So why talk about whiteness? So to understand racism and racial inequality, we have to talk about whiteness. We have to talk about the standard that we hold other people against. The standard that we use as the norm for our culture, for how we do things, for how we see the world. And when I say we, I just mean the societal we. But when we talk about race, we usually don't talk about whiteness. We talk about inequality, and then we talk about the people who are oppressed, which is a good thing. But if we're only focusing on that and we're not focusing on the people who are privileged, then we're missing really crucial parts of that. So to understand how a system works, and I'm going to argue that racism is a system, we need to look at the people who created it. Who's invested in it? Who benefits, right? We need to look at the people in power, people who have the power to control what those things mean or how things work, rather than the people who are oppressed by it. So if we're going to really dismantle our system of race and racism, then we really have to look at whiteness. Another reason is that white people tend to not be aware of the privileges that they have, because it's the absence of something, right? It's the absence of oppression. And it's very difficult to see the absence of something. You just think everything's fine, right? If discrimination is present, then it's visible. But if it's not present, then you don't really feel it. So white supremacy, sort of as this amorphous thing, aims to focus and blame inequality on supposed biological or cultural differences. So even when it was more well established that race was not biological, people started talking about, oh, it's cultural differences, right? And that's also sort of a big issue. It distracts us from shining a light on whiteness, on white supremacy, and the ways that we participate in it, right? So lots of us probably in this webinar like to think of ourselves as not racist, right? As not doing racist things. But as an individual, not being racist does not mean that racism doesn't exist, right? And it doesn't mean that we don't unwittingly or unknowingly or complicitly participate in that. So let's go and watch another video clip, a short one on race and language that I really like. So this is from a documentary coming out next month called Talking Black in America.
I think to the extent that we can shine a light on the ways in which these misconceptions about language sort of perpetuate these racist ideas that continue to circulate in our society, it's important, especially when it comes to language, because a lot of times people assume that there is some linguistic basis for the stigma, and they're not aware that it really is about the people.
What does standard English accomplish that these so-called versions of substandard English don't accomplish in terms of communication? Nothing. You know what I mean? Nothing at all. Anything that seems to stand in the way, you say, oh, it'll help you get a job. Well, is that because of the language? It's not that you're unable to communicate, or is that because of all these various isms that stand in the way of you being able to take care of yourself, because you live in a country that likes to do things like stand in the way of certain people being able to take care of themselves?
The issue, Mr. Chairman, has received a lot of attention all over the United States. And I simply want to say that I think Ebonics is absurd.
In the mid-90s, 1995, 1996, there was a big Ebonics controversy.
Many linguists have stated that Oakland's decision is credible, it is rational, and a potentially effective way to improve the academic standard of its students.
The Oakland School Board was trying to get what had been fairly solidly established linguistic research into schools. And the public really misunderstood the message of what was happening and reacted in ways that kind of set back what educators were trying to do with language.
That's just bad English, isn't it? How could you say that's a language?
No, that's different English.
No,
that's
it's
not
bad
no,
English.
That's not, but that's your opinion that it's bad.
No, it's not my opinion.
A lot of teachers just kind of take what they've heard, sort of the predominant social narratives, and they just sort of, reproduce them.
The average citizen who encountered the term of Ebonics during the Oakland controversy did so at a time when late-night talk show hosts were, lampooning the term. And as a professional linguist, I was disheartened when I saw so many people mocking a term that referred to linguistic circumstances that I think should be better understood by the entire nation, but which have been the object of linguistic discrimination since the inception of slavery.
All right, and we're back. So that clip was talking about sort of the way that white people's English is taken as the standard, right? That there are particular ways of English that are about being educated, they're about being white, that we tend to police, right? It's not that other ways of speaking aren't communicative, but they aren't the right ways according to a system that was built through white supremacy. And you might say, she says we're supposed to be talking about whiteness. And that whole clip talked about Black people, right? One way to really highlight whiteness, especially if you're immersed in it, is to center people of color, center Blackness, right? And imagine what a world is like centered around that. And then we can see how whiteness is so pervasive as the standard otherwise. So systemic racism is what I'm talking about when I talk about racism. So racism is more than individual actions or beliefs and made of more than a few instances. So what I mean by this is that we tend to think about race as somebody said a racist thing or did a racist thing or discriminated. And we tend to talk about racism on this really individual level, about individuals making choices. And it's not that individuals making choices don't contribute to this, but racism as an ism is a system in our society. And a system that works in particular ways that we can participate in or not. So it's very important as a sociologist that race is a system, right? If it was just about an individual or an individual's belief, then we can, shame that individual or, outlaw certain things, and then everything is fine. But when race is a system, it's bigger than individuals, right? So when I say systemic, I mean big picture. I mean patterns. And let me check my time again. All right, so I mean big picture, I mean patterns. And so there's a distinction here between discrimination, which can be an instance, and oppression, which is part of a system of discrimination. So if I was teaching a class and I said a particular comment about people who wear blue shirts, and it was a negative comment, And maybe I said I might grade them worse because I thought they weren't great people. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, but this is the kind of like trait system that we're using when we use race, right? Even if I was prejudiced against blue-shirted people, even if I was prejudiced and discriminated against blue-shirted people, they could leave the system that is my classroom, and that does not exist elsewhere. But if we're talking about our present racial system and engaging in privileges and discriminations based on that, that person leaves my classroom, they get the same thing elsewhere. They haven't left that system. So if I discriminate in that way, it's reproducing an already existing system that adds, it's an additive thing. So systems can refer to systems of symbols, exactly, language, which we just talked about, norms, rules, policies, laws, right? We have a lot of laws that were enshrined in the United States as a result of racial fear, for example. It might also refer to structures like organizations, institutions, government, economy, right? When I'm talking about a system, I'm talking about those things, right? The things that guide us as humans, right? The things that might teach us as humans to either actively or passively accept or perpetuate racism. And again, this isn't always apparent to people with privilege, right? So if you're experiencing discrimination, you see that you're experiencing a thing. If it's just the lack of discrimination, there's nothing for you to gauge. So systemic privilege, and I like to talk about systemic privilege because when people talk about privilege, they think about like, well, I'm a privileged person. I was privileged to know so-and-so, or I was privileged to go to college. And that's not necessarily what we mean. We mean people who are of a category that has benefits in society on a systemic level. So not just from one person or a few interactions with people, but historically, over time, and within institutions. And that can include just having more people who are like you in control of the decision-making process. So privilege is made up of taken for granted benefits given to a large group of people based on a trait, right? Whether that's based on gender, based on race, what have you. It's a trait that people have and may get benefits based on that. And when I say benefits, I can mean something like the benefit of the doubt. We're seeing that in a lot of these cases across the country where, white folks who have encounters with the police are often given the benefit of the doubt that they're probably not criminals or they made a mistake rather than they are inherently this dangerous, bad person, right? So even just that benefit of the doubt is a privilege that a lot of white folks have. And the outcomes of this can be seen in things like health, right? So if we look at big data on health, we see there are massive amounts of data that support being white. It contributes to you being healthier in a variety of ways, regardless of class. It can be seen in things like representation. Do you see people like you represented in your world, represented as being leaders, right? So whiteness and racism, we can reproduce it, we can participate in it, and we can be complicit in it without being white supremacists, without being active, overt racists, right? And I think this is the really hard thing for people because often people want to be, they want to say, no, I'm not racist. I didn't mean that to be racist, or that wasn't my intention. But it's not about intentions, it's about the outcomes. And not the outcomes of just the individual, but the outcomes and the patterns that we see. So if you think about systemic racism, you need to focus on the outcomes. What are the consequences? What are the facts, right? And we often get carried away focusing on one individual and what they said and how it was racist. But what we really need to focus on is this larger system, because we can deal with one person's racism, but that doesn't eliminate racism as a system. White supremacy relies on our complicity, which means going along with it, letting it happen, our desire for comfort, right? Racism is a hard topic. People get really uncomfortable talking about it. People do not like to be called racist or to be pointed out that something they did or said might have been racist, right? So we want to be comfortable. We don't want to be wrong. Most of us don't want to be racist. And also this focus on individuals, which allows us to be distracted from the system of racism. So what do we do to challenge white supremacy? Obviously, there's lots of things, and this whole series is going to work on kinds of things that we can do to challenge white supremacy, but I'm going to give you a few. So center people of color. So POC is people of color. And particularly Black and Indigenous culture, perspectives, experiences. And when I say center people of color is that try using them as the standard. What would life be like if their culture, their way of doing things, their history was used as the standard? Because that one thing that does is highlight the way whiteness is used as a standard. But also centering people of color allows us to decenter white people. It allows us to challenge the ways that whiteness gets centered. If you are dealing with racism, do not center yourself, your emotions, or your experiences. So, it's hard to deal with, challenging your own racism, right? But to make it about you is not solving the problem of racism. So listen to and amplify the voices of people of color. Do not appropriate culture. So appropriating culture doesn't mean you're a friend of a person of color. It doesn't mean you understand their culture. It just means that you maybe don't understand the significance of the thing in their culture, or maybe you just haven't really thought about how that might affect someone else. If you use their culture, say as a costume, like we're coming up on Halloween and lots of people have racial costumes that they use for Halloween, and unthinkingly or not caring that those things might hurt other people. Err on the side of doing no harm, right? What's it to you if you wear a different costume that's not racist, right? What's it to you if you don't use a particular word? Does it really affect you all that much? And if not, then is it in the best interest of all of us just to use a different word, do a different thing, do things differently, right? If it's going to benefit this group of people that we know experience oppression by changing this one thing that you might do, err on the side of not doing harm at all. Utilize your white privilege for anti-racist means. This does not mean take over conversations, but in certain situations, white people are given more credibility. So, for example, with the police. So as a white person, if you are with a Black person in encountering the police, there's a chance that you are going to see the police giving you more respect, right? And there are ways that you can use that privilege, that credence. For example, I'm a white person. When I talk about racism, people are more likely to listen to what I'm saying about racism than a person of color, because supposedly I'm not invested in it. Educate yourself and do the work. Do not rely on people of color to educate you or to wait on them to speak up about racism or white supremacy. They're already dealing with quite a lot. If you need to have guidance on education, you can find resources like SURJ, Showing Up for Racial Justice, other white people who engage in anti-racism, and process those things with them rather than rely on people of color to do that work. If something is potentially racist or based in white supremacy that's pointed out to you, a lot of our defenses go up, right? But what we should do is just apologize and deeply consider that, right? Perhaps even do some research. We might not know why that thing might affect people in a particular way, right? We might not know the history behind certain things. And so if we take a step back and educate ourselves, then we might see some of that perspective that we're missing as white people. And don't try to explain it away, right? I only said this because of this. While that may be true, it doesn't fix the outcome of whatever it is you said or did. And hopefully that gets us started in this conversation on anti-racism and looking at whiteness and how whiteness can be utilized and analyzed for the good of anti-racism.
Thanks, Michaela. That was really informative. It is almost 8 o'clock, so please feel free to leave if you want. But if you do have questions for Dr. Null, go ahead and put them in the chat or the Q&A. I did have a question about making the slides available. Would that be possible?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So would it be okay for us to put those on our website, or the other option would be we can email them out to people who request them?
No, the website is great, and I will put the links to the 2 videos in there as well.
Okay, so we'll have those on our website probably tomorrow, not today. If you have any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or Q&A. I do see the question about when was melanin discovered. That sounds like a research question. I tried to Google it really quickly and I couldn't find out. So I'll probably look it up tomorrow. If you want to give me your email address, I'll send that to you.
That's an interesting question. I certainly don't know the answer to it.
Yeah. Could you address cultural appropriation in more detail?
Okay. So cultural appropriation is using an element of someone else's culture, a culture that is not your own, for your own means. So that could look like using something that's really significant, like a headdress, right? In Native American culture, a headdress is really of a particular importance. It has particular meanings, but lots of people in their Halloween costumes, for example, will use a headdress, right? So what you're doing then is using something that's revered in someone else's culture as something that you're just playing around with. And one of the important things about cultural appropriation is that as someone who can put it on as a costume, you don't have to suffer the consequences. So Native Americans are some of the most impoverished people in the United States. So you can play with their culture and then take that off, and you don't ever have to deal with the consequences of the stereotypes, of the systemic things that they experience. And that's why it can be harmful, not because people are trying to be petty or arbitrary, but because the significance of it. So, it's like taking, something that's important to you or revered to you and just using it as a prop. Or sometimes used for capitalism.
This is an interesting question. Just speculating, can you imagine what could have been done differently in history so that this systemic racism would not have developed? Other economic system, no slavery? Can you? That's a
big question. It's a great question.
Yeah.
I mean, trying to imagine what a different world could be like, that's really important. I mean, I would say that, amassing wealth would have had to be different. So one of the things that happened is that people who lived in areas where you could grow crops rather than having to forage for food, right? If you can grow crops and stock them, then you can spend more time on other things, right? And you can amass wealth. And once people start to do that, and they did it in certain areas because in part of, what was, farmable land, they start to amass that wealth, whether it's, trade wealth or later monetary wealth. And then that power starts to amass. So, I mean, I would think that some things would have to be different to make it so that there were a small group of people in Europe who were able to then go and take over and colonize all these other countries. Because that's another thing that we see is that the countries that were colonized, I mean, the United States is sort of a special case, but India and lots of other countries that were colonized, African countries, we see them economically, they were depleted, right? Their wealth was taken from them. So, I mean, a good start with colonization would have to not happen. And I know that's probably not the best answer, but I mean, I'll be thinking about this for a while.
Here's a comment. Let's see here. As a person of color, it's very difficult to get white people to educate themselves and even speak out when they see racism perpetuated against a person of color. Why are these so difficult for white people to do, I guess?
I mean, white culture, man. White people are taught to be polite. They're taught to be non-confrontational. And the culture that they experience is to sort of go along, right? To not rock the boat. And also there are consequences for doing that. And I'm not saying they're like super negative consequences, but I'm saying that when you have privilege, to give up that privilege can sometimes be really difficult. It sucks, but you're giving up something, right? And to put yourself out like that can be hard. Also, we're never taught how to do this. We're never taught how to speak up, except for, if in school they're talking about bullying, they might tell us what to do, but we don't ever practice, right? So as white people, one thing we can do is practice what we would do. And I don't mean like think about it in your head, I mean role play it with people. Think about what resources are out there. I think in one of the conversations that we had over the summer, one of the questions that came up is like, well, what do you do if you're not supposed to call the police? What are you supposed to do, right? So know what those resources are, know what your options are, and sort of make that something that is more naturalized in your life. And that in part can make it easier when you practice.
Great. Here's another question. Did land ownership play a key role in the evolution of white supremacy?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So land ownership was a huge part of amassing wealth in the United States. And as you may know, we policed who could own land in various different ways. But one of the ways was along the lines of race. One of the things that happened is that there were times where people who were white were given land ownership benefits that people of color did not get. So I'm talking about things like the Homestead Act, where out west, people were given land for free or cheap if they were white. And what happens is when you own land, you own equity, and you can use that equity for lots of things. And that's an amass of wealth that added up over time makes a huge difference. It also allows some people to control other groups of people.
Here's a question. I run into a lot of people who use individual examples to explain away their racism. For example, they saw several people online using their stimulus checks for frivolous things, so they believe African Americans do this culturally and shouldn't be given handouts. How can I best argue against this?
Ooh. That's hard because when people go to these individualistic explanations, it can feel very real to them, especially if they've seen it or experienced it. And one thing that we say in the social sciences is anecdotes can be useful to demonstrate things, but anecdotes are not data, right? So you have a couple of data points where you've seen someone talk about, using things in a particular way, being on welfare, what have you, right? But that does not tell you, you're limited. Like if you only see one speck of a thing, you're not seeing the whole picture, right? The other thing that I would say about that is who gets to decide what's frivolous? Who gets to decide what people spend their money on? And when we look at what poor people spend their money on, one thing that we see is part of it is for survival, right? So if somebody's on food stamps and they buy a steak, you think, well, you could have bought this and this and this, right? But maybe you don't know what that might be for. You don't know the purpose of that. So we all know that really good meals make a difference in how we feel. They change our morale, right? Sometimes you just need a really good meal. And that is just as important as a lot of other things for people's survival.
Let's see here. Has any of your research or any research that you know about looked at the ways white supremacy benefits or hurts Asians?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that we tend to talk about racism as a black and white issue, but there's lots of research on the ways Asians have experienced white supremacy and the ways that they have the particular ways that racism against Asians and Asian Americans sort of, what's the word I'm thinking of, is implemented, or the logic of it. So one thing that we can look at is the Chinese Exclusion Act and the racial ideas around that particular thing. So the villainization of Chinese, the moral, treating the Chinese as though they're are morally inferior, that they're unable to control themselves, that we back then they believed that Asian men were going to seduce white women. So we had a lot of these same ideas, but we also have to think about that Asian Americans are a large group of people, right? And so just among Asian Americans, there's lots of different experiences in terms of that. But also Asian Americans have a really interesting place because often they're used as a racial example of what you can do if you work hard, right? They're used as a positive stereotype, but that can also be harmful because it's setting up particular expectations. But yes, there's lots and lots of research on the ways that that racism affects those of Asian descent. Yeah.
Okay, the next question. Let's see, it looks like the question is about just a small number of people who are practicing anti-racism, doing the training. And if you're not woke, it doesn't really affect a lot of people. So how would a white person stay focused on practicing anti-racism? How does it maybe grow to encompass, more people and make, I guess, change, make change?
Oh, okay. So, the idea of anti-racism being sort of a small exclusive thing, how do we mainstream it? I mean, day by day, we do things like this. We talk to people about anti-racism, about the history of race. I can also give you a list of documentaries that are on race. One that I liked to use in my classroom was Race, the Power of an Illusion. It's a 3-part series that really goes into depth about the history of race. You know, I think there are ways that the mainstreaming of anti-racism is happening, but I think that cannot happen as like a singular movement. So what we see is that there's a movement, and sometimes that gets watered down or appropriated, and people think that they are sort of on board with anti-racism, but there's sort of a anti-racist in name and belief, but not necessarily action, right? So I think that one thing is by getting groups of people together, white folks and people of color, in groups like SURJ or a variety of other anti-racist groups, to really talk about that and create community around anti-racism, right? Make sure that you are in a network of people who can support you in continuing to try to be anti-racist, and just build from there.
I had a good comment in one of the conversations from the summer, someone who said that a lot of families are becoming integrated, and where you'll have Black and white people in the same family, and that really is a great place for people to start seeing other people's experiences, and these are people that they love and care about, and so I thought that was a good comment.
Yeah, absolutely. And even though we're living in the age we are, we're still living in a fairly segregated country. Even in the North, where we like to think about ourselves as more progressive in the South, but we're relatively segregated, and white people can often choose to not interact with Black people, whereas not necessarily the other way around. And so I might have lost my train of thought.
That's okay. That actually is related to the next question. Why are whites oblivious to diversity? Why don't they see it when their workspace, etc., is lily white? Some even scoff at diversifying their work or personal space.
I think that it's something that when people look like you, it's easy not to question that. And when you are a white person who many times have grown up in communities that are isolated, right? You don't expect diversity, or one person of color looks like diversity to you. And or two different ethnic white people seems like diversity, right? So I think a lot of white people have a misunderstanding of what diversity means, and certainly about how to achieve it, right? Diversity and inclusion also requires that we change some of the structures and our ways of doing things, and that can be a little harder, right? So so it's illegal to discriminate against people based on race, right? For jobs and for other things, but who enforces that? How do we go about making sure that doesn't happen, right? It has to be something that's reported, a court case is brought up over it, and that isn't necessarily always something that people have the power or resources to do. So our systems are set up so that we don't challenge these things. And when you are surrounded by other white people who have been taught to fear the challenge of those things, then it can be easy to stay in your little bubble.
Great. Just a comment. I just finished reading Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. In one of the first chapters, she was surprised when she was told that there are no Black people in Africa. There are Kenyans, Somalis, etc. And this poster says, I really like that, helps me understand a bit better. Just wanted to share that. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's this idea of ethnic groups, because skin color isn't necessarily something that you can use as a defining characteristic in the same way that we do in the United States. And also it's important to say that a lot of times when people talk about Africa, they talk about it as though it's this one group of people, when it's really this very, very diverse, both culturally and biologically, a very diverse place. These questions are great.
Yeah. Looks like most of them, it looks like we've answered all the questions. I'm just looking at the chat. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for coming today. Thank you, Dr. Null, for sharing your knowledge. I learned a lot, and I hope that you did too. And check out wrightlibrary.org/anti-racism 101 for the next in the series, which is Beyond Colorblindness. So thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Null, and have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.